those of you who don't know me, I'm Dr. Watts. I teach economics and other assorted business classes here. And I also direct the Institute for Economic Education. And it's under the auspices of the Economic Institute that we are privileged to have as our guest speaker tonight, Dr. Schansberg. Dr. Schansberg is an acquaintance of mine from up north, and he teaches at Indiana University Southeast in Jeffersonville. New Albany. He's living there. New Albany is in the Louisville area on the Ohio River. And he and I are acquainted from an institution we both worked with up in Indiana. It was a public policy analysis advocacy type organization. And I was very impressed with Dr. Schansberg. He deals with three of my favorite topics: politics, economics, and religion. And what he's going to do for us tonight is being very knowledgeable in all three of those areas and being quite a student of scriptures in addition to economics and politics, political theory. He's going to give us a sound, biblical-based analysis of politics, kind of assessing what government should do, what government can do. What most impressed me about Dr. Schansberg when I first met him was how calm he can be when dealing with these issues, and how patient with people on the other side, I mean, whom we both know are wrong, but he can listen and be patient and really engage people whom we might disagree with on their own terms. I mean, really listen to their arguments and really critique them from a dispassionate perspective, and a perspective that's grounded in a solid Christian faith and a confession of Jesus Christ as Lord and of the Bible as the authority for all we do in life. So I'm very impressed with him. We're privileged really to have him here with us, and I encourage you to pay careful attention. I think there's something for everybody here: economics, politics, and religion, right? Those are my three favorite things. I say that genuinely. So I'll hand it over to Dr. Schansberg here, but first of all, I'll ask a blessing on our time together. So let's bow our heads. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day, Lord, and we thank you for ETBU and the freedom to come together to learn and to base our learning on your word, on your promises to us. And Lord, just help us tonight to listen and hear and learn from our guest speaker. We thank you for bringing him here safely. Bless our time of fellowship together and our time of learning together. And we thank you for the gifts you've given us, Lord, the forgiveness, life, and salvation that we have in Jesus Christ. And we ask all of this in his name. Amen. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Dr. Schansberg.
So we are going to talk about politics and religion tonight. Those are two exciting, controversial topics. If things get boring, we'll talk about sex and money. So those are the other two we can bring in. But we probably have enough to cover here. Go start a joke off of these things. So here's my joke. There's a deserted island, of course, with three people on it, right? And it's a botanist, an engineer, and an economist. And they talk about a bunch of stuff, and eventually start arguing about which is the oldest profession. And the botanist says, well, it's obviously us, because on the third day the Lord created vegetation. And the engineer says, no. Before that, remember that God took the chaos and made it into order, right? So engineering is older than botany. And the economist says, wait, who do you think created all the chaos? And that's the economist, right? So what economists are known for is bringing chaos to the table in a sense. Harry Truman said that he wanted a one-armed economist because the economists he knew were always saying, well, on the one hand, on the other hand. And he got tired of that. He wanted just simple answers. And a lot of things in life that are complicated and interesting don't have simple answers, right? So there's a lot of on the one hand, on the other hand thing, analysis that goes into stuff. And certainly that's the case tonight. But at the same time, we want to bring order, right? Instead of the chaos of politics, and we've seen a lot of chaos the last 12 months, right, in politics. What can we bring to the table as economists, as Christians? What do the scriptures tell us? What do the basics of economics and political economy tell us that can be helpful? So this talk is based on my 2003 book, Turn Neither to the Right nor to the Left. If you're interested in a copy, they're only $5. You can get it on Amazon and other places, but it's more expensive there. But if you're interested afterwards, They're only $5. And there's a 2002 Markets and Morality paper, if you want a shorter version, if this piques your interest and you want to read a smaller version of it. Also, I should mention that I'm an Aggie. I went to Texas A&M for my graduate work, so it's good to be back in Texas again. I've just moved up a notch for some of you and down a few notches for others of you, but it is what it is. So I enjoyed my 6 years in Texas very much. So with no further ado, let's get to the talk. So my first goal then is to encourage Christians, really people in general, to think and pray about politics more than they talk and act in the political arena. And why is that the case? Well, because government is really powerful and it's a big deal. Maybe you've heard sermons before where a pastor will talk about sex. You know, sex is a really awesome thing. It's a great gift from God, but it needs to be practiced within the institution of marriage, right? That's how God has designed it. Dynamite is an awesome thing, but it has to be used in its proper bounds, right? Dynamite in the wrong place, sex in the wrong place, government in the wrong place. They cause a lot of damage. And so if government's a big deal, if government's powerful, you don't just play with powerful tools casually, right? You don't just play with powerful, dangerous things in a cavalier manner. You should know what you're doing. And government is very powerful. And so you should think a lot about it. Just look at human history and what government has done to people. I mean, in one sense, the history of government is messing with individuals or tribes or nations. You could talk about world history from that standpoint. And government can do great things, but it can do great, awful things as well. And so don't play with government. It's not something to play with. It's something to understand. The other problem is that it's really complex, right? Government activity, we're talking about social science, we're talking about trying to understand why people do what they do. We're trying to manipulate macroeconomy. We're trying to fix the healthcare system. These are very complex things. I want to give you 5 I words that help explain its complexity. The first is it's just inherently so, right? The nature of government, the nature of public policy is it's an inherently complex arena. Sometimes it's not, right? I mean, they fix, like you do a pothole, right? You fix a hole in a road. Even that's a fairly complex thing. But then it goes up to monetary policy. It goes to healthcare and trying to fix things, but very, very complex. Given its complexity, and we have to spend some time on it. Second, rational ignorance, right? So if you think back to microeconomics, what is rational ignorance from public choice economics? What is rational ignorance when we talk about how politics works? Remember that from the class. Rational ignorance. Anybody remember that? Nobody? Who should know this? What's not a rationality? Come on, guys, it's rational ignorance. You're explaining this to your parents, or your best friends. I don't know. That's good ignorance. I don't know if it's rational. The other thing we call is rational ignorance and rational apathy, right? Ignorance is I don't know. Apathy is I don't care. I asked a student once to define apathy for me, and they shrugged their shoulders. They go, exactly, that's right. They didn't know they'd answered it properly. But why is it rational to be ignorant about politics? Well, because what do you all offer the political arena? One vote, and later in life you'll have a few $100 you might throw at a candidate, right? What is your one vote going to do to the political process? What's your $100 going to do to the political process? What's your angry letter to Congress going to do in the political process? I can't get my fingers that close together, right? You have very little to offer the political process, right? So if the benefits of you taking action are that big, how much energy should you put into politics? About that much, right? And so what happens? Well, how much do people know about politics? Not very much. They know very little about politics, but economists say, well, it's rational. It's rational. We should expect people to know very little about politics. We're blessed to live in a country where you can mow your lawn and raise your kids and study accounting and do that stuff. You don't have to worry about politics to live life in America. We know it goes on. We know it affects people. But we also know, look, I can't change that. I'm not going to read a bunch of articles. I'm not going to read a bunch of studies from a pointy-headed economist. I'm not going to go there, right? And even if you get rid of my ignorance for free, I'm not going to take action. I'm not going to write letters. I'm not going to march on Austin to change things. I got other things to do. There's a football game on. I got to mow my lawn. So it's rational for people to be ignorant. But back to the point here, if we're ignorant about it, that's not good, right? We're ignorant about something that's really powerful. One of the most interesting things about this most recent election is we saw a lot of idolatry towards politics, right? And we'll talk more about this later, but people putting a whole bunch of weight into the political process, right? And so you have a lot of upset, a lot of energy, a lot of whatever, along with mostly ignorance. So you have ignorance and passion combined is what we saw the last 12 months, right? Most people know very, very little about politics, and yet at times they put tons of energy into it, and it makes no sense. So this doesn't, if we're going to be passionate about government, if we're going to get involved with government, it starts with understanding our ignorance and doing something about it, right? That you've got to make investments if you're going to play with this complicated toy. Next point is selfish interest, right? When we look at those actors in political markets, right, many times they have something to gain from the political activity, right? When they lobby for something, they're going to argue it's for the good of the country, but often it also is for their own good as well. And so we want to recognize that people have selfish interests within politics, and that may drive their motives for embracing different public policies. When they share their information with us, right, to help us with our ignorance, is that objective information? I don't think so, right? Because they're telling us things that are for their own good. And so we're not sure that the information they're going to share with us is objective. And the last point is the word intentions, right? That it's not good enough to chuck dynamite in a cave and go, well, I'm sorry, I didn't know there was anybody in there, right? I didn't mean to cause any harm. Kind of sorry about that, right? I passed this public policy and it caused tons of damage. Sorry. Sorry about that. Good intentions aren't good enough, right? Good intentions are nice, I guess, but what we're after is good outcomes. And so if we don't know what we're doing, if we're dealing with a complex topic, we don't know much about it, we're falling prey to interest groups that are telling us, twisting information in markets, we're likely to fall for something that is merely good intentions. Why is this a big deal? Well, I think it's just a big deal by itself, right? What's sadder than seeing people do something with the best of intentions and reaching a goal that's the very opposite of what they say they want? I mean, what's more pathetic than that? Second, as Christians, it's much more serious than that. The third commandment is, do not take the Lord God's name in vain. Don't misuse God's name. Whenever I walk into the political arena and I say I'm a Christian, I'm taking God's name with me. And if I'm goofing stuff up in the political market, right, if I'm causing damage to people, that's not just me being a knucklehead. I'm trashing the name of God when I do that. It's a violation of the third commandment. So as Christians in particular, if we're identifying ourselves as Christians in the political arena, we need to be very careful that we're actually doing something very helpful, rather than just merely having good intentions. Another point to make here is we've got think and pray. 1 Timothy 2:1-3 gives us a command. If you're going to be involved in politics, a direct command we have in Scripture comes from Paul at 1 Timothy 2:1 and 2 and into verse 3, that we are to pray for those in authority. And so if you're going to take action in politics, the very first thing you have to be doing is praying for people. So that's tough for some people at certain times, right? Some of you are not big fans of the current president, right? Maybe many of you, right? But your first requirement politically, biblically, is that you should be praying for the president. If you're not praying for President Trump, you cannot criticize him biblically. You have to be faithful to what the Word says, which is to pray for those in authority. When you do that, then you can critique him. The last 8 years, other people have had challenges here, right? They wanted to critique President Obama. I'm not sure they were praying for him. The first commandment we're given in Scripture in this regard, the first direct commandment, is that you have to pray for those in authority. So whatever you're doing in politics, if you're not starting with prayer, then you're committing sin and you need to get that fixed. And I'll come back to this, but the biggest mistake that Christians make, I think, in this arena is that they make two basic mistakes. They say, well, I'm called not to do blank. So we should pass a law against blank. Or I'm called to do blank. Therefore, we should have a law that mandates blank, right? So for example, we might say, well, we're commanded to be charitable to other people, the needy. And they'll take the next step and say, well, therefore we ought to have welfare programs. That doesn't follow, right? The command to me as an individual does not necessarily go to the need for a law. If I believe the Bible says I shouldn't smoke pot, all right, that doesn't follow that I pursue a law against pot, right? So if it's wrong for me, it doesn't mean I go to law. If it's right for me, it doesn't mean I go to law. And a lot of times Christians are very sloppy about this. They'll just pass over this and say, well, if it's a sin or it's something I should do, then let's make a law about it. And that, as we'll get to later, it's more complicated than that. Goal number 2 is that we want to wrestle with the efficacy of government activism. When does it work? Okay? When is it effective? All right, so the 3 criteria that I develop in the book, right? So the first one is that if we're going to pursue godly goals with public policy, then we want to talk about the means to those ends. And the means to the ends have to fit 3 criteria. The means to the ends have to be biblical, all right? The Bible teaches that homosexual conduct is a sin, all right? So let's say that I have that understanding of Scripture, and therefore my approach to that is to carry around a sign that says God hates fags. Okay? Is that an ethical or biblical approach to that issue? No. That's not an ethical or biblical means to that end. Right? Just because something is a sin doesn't mean anything goes in my approach to that sin. Right? So that doesn't work. Let's say that Tyler said I'm a pretty nice guy, but let's say you don't really know me very well, and I've got a metal object in the car outside, and I meet Zach, and Zach has a daughter who is sick and needs medicine, and it costs $300, and Zach doesn't have the money. So I go out to my car, I get the metal pointed thing, and I just walk around the parking lot afterwards. I'm very nice about it, and I say, Drew, you got 20 bucks I can have? He's like, yeah, here's 30. For Drew, right? Yes, all right. Got 30 bucks, right? And then I go to Jesse, and I'm pointing the gun, and he goes, I go, you got 20 bucks? He goes, no, I don't have anything. I'm like, all right, cool. And then I go to Deontay, right? 20 bucks, sure. And I just walk around all night with the gun, right? And I keep pointing at people, and I just go, can I have some money? And everyone's very nice to me back. It's really cool how friendly they are to me. And then I get the $300. I give it to Zach. Zach goes to get the medicine for his daughter. His daughter is treated. Bingo. Was that a godly goal? To give medicine to his daughter? Was that a godly? Sure. Was that a godly means to the end? I don't think so. So the means that we choose to the ends have to themselves be ethical, have to themselves be biblical. It's not anything goes. It's not the means justify the ends, right? So the means have to be ethical. Second, they have to be appropriate or consistent. Let's say that I wanted to fight gambling in the state. And I'm a pastor of a local church. But from the pulpit, I never talk about gambling from the pulpit. I have congregation members who put money on golf games, who play the lottery, who play the stock market like it's some big roulette wheel. I never deal with that in my own church. Is it appropriate for me to look for legislation if I don't deal with it in my own congregation? I don't think so. Right? If I'm not willing to preach to my own people about gambling and the supposed evil of it, how on earth can I go out and pursue that as a legislative remedy? It's not consistent. Al Gore, have you all heard of Al Gore? Ran for president back in the day, vice president. Most of the time, we get to hear about the tax returns of our candidates. Al Gore's tax returns came out, and it turns out on an income of about, I think it was $500,000, Al Gore, who was supposedly a good Southern Baptist, gave $300 to charity. That sound like a good Christian to you? $300 total donations to all charities and churches combined? Not quite the tithe, I would say, right? 0.003% of his income. So the funny thing about Al, though, is that he was willing to vote for legislation to take your money to give to poor people, but he wasn't giving his own money to poor people. That's not consistent. If I'm not helping poor people myself, how on earth can I say I should be forcing you all to give money, right? It's not consistent. So on a personal behavior matter, I need to be consistent. The second is social outcomes of public policy. When I talk to people on the left and they say they care about the poor, I say, well, how come you don't do anything about policies that increase the price of food, clothing, and shelter? How come you don't deal with the government's monopoly in K through 12? How come you support laws that impose a 15.3% tax on every dollar earned by the working poor? How come you support laws that make it more expensive to hire less skilled labor? That's not consistent with what your goals are. On the right, there's a lot of upset about same-sex marriage. Well, in the church, we've got a huge problem with divorce. People say same-sex marriage has destroyed marriage in this country. Well, actually, divorce has destroyed marriage the last 50 years, right? So when the church has not done its due diligence on divorce, it has lost its ability to talk about same-sex marriage, right? They can still speak, but its witness there is at minimum greatly diminished. So it's a consistency problem. We did not talk about it properly in the context of divorce, and so that makes it difficult for us to talk about in the context of this other public policy issue. The third criteria is that if it's biblical, if it's appropriate, the last one is crucial too. Does it work, right? I'm going to now advocate a public policy. Does it actually accomplish the goals that I think it will? When I hand something to the government, right, in general or in particular, I believe that the government agents will have good knowledge and good motives, right? I believe they know enough and are motivated cleanly enough, purely enough, to do a good job of public policy. What if they don't have good knowledge, but they have good motives? What would we call that, and what would we expect from them? Bad knowledge, good motives. What kind of policy outcomes will we get? You think bad knowledge or good motives? Bad policy. Good motives means what? They're trying to do the right thing. Back to good intentions, right? Trying to do the right thing. Nice try, guys. Appreciate that. But it didn't work very well, right? What if they have good knowledge and bad motives? What kind of policy do we get? Good knowledge, bad motives. Corruption, right? They'll be really good at taking our money. They'll be really good at messing with us. All right, those aren't any good. What if you have bad knowledge and bad motives? I don't know what that is, but I don't want that either, right? So whenever you invoke the government, you're assuming that they're pretty good on the knowledge and motives part, right? And that they're going to invoke policies that actually accomplish what they set out to accomplish. And that turns out to be very difficult. So the drug laws, for example, are the drug laws effective? Do they cause ancillary damage to other parties? Does the minimum wage work as it should? It'll lift the wages of people that keep their jobs. It's going to reduce employment for some people. Does welfare policy work the way it's supposed to, right? We have to ask these practical questions. Even if you get past the biblical test and the consistency test, if you're advocating policies that actually cause more damage than good, then don't do it, right? Go do something else, because policy is not the right way to go. So what about a framework then for issues of social morality, economic justice, and social justice? So these are the three categories I talk about in the book, right? If you think about, you can't just legislate against all sins. You've got to have some kind of category. If you want to legislate against all sin, you're going to have a lot of legislation, right? Because there's a lot of sin out there. You're going to have tons of legislation. So what I use is a spectrum that talks about the costs being direct and significant. And the idea is that as the costs become more significant and as the costs become more direct, right, we're moving up to this part of the spectrum. As costs are less direct and smaller, then they're down at that end of the spectrum. And what I argue in the book basically then is that if we're in this area, that's the easiest place to make a biblical argument, ethical, practical, for the government to step in and make a difference. And that we have sins that are down here that there's not going to be as much for government to do. And this is not an area for Christians to be advocating government policy. So what are some examples of sins, and where would you put them on the graph? What would an example be? Name a sin, and where would we put it? Who? Murder. So where would murder be? Right up here, right? If I murder somebody, I'm imposing direct costs on them, and I would say those are significant costs, right? So that's up there, right? Other examples.
Adultery.
Who?
Adultery. Adultery.
Adultery. Where would adultery go? Pretty high, right? I mean, it's not murder, but it's imposing significant costs. It's not imposing costs on the person I'm committing the adultery with as much. But I'm certainly imposing costs on other parties, right? The other part, my wife, any kids that are involved. So the costs are a little less direct, but they're certainly significant. We're still up in this part of the. All right, what else?
Smoking.
Smoking. Yeah, where's smoking go? I mean, that's not murder, but it's kind of long term. Who are the costs imposed on? Myself, right? Largely, but there's secondhand smoke, so we can kind of move up here. I'm kind of sticking other people with some costs. I'm imposing costs on other people, right? All right, other examples.
Stealing.
Stealing, okay? Stealing's kind of up that way. How about eating too much pie? Where would you put that? That second piece of pie. Where does that go? What about failing to encourage my kids? Where does that go? What about not taking cookies to the new neighbors across the street? What about Jehovah's Witnesses? Where do I put them? What are you laughing at? Where do you put the JWs here? Is that murder? Is that too much pie? Where does that go? Does forcing a false religion cause damage? Right? So I don't know, but I mean, how about Islam, right? Where do you put false religions on this? It's more than pie, but less than murder, I think, right? Any other examples? So when do you bring government in? Where do you want the government to intervene? Murder? Pie? Pot? JWs? Right? And so the argument is, look, when we're up here, it's easier to bring government in. It's easier as a Christian to make the case from a justice perspective that government ought to be involved and that Christians ought to be helping to make that case. How about sex trafficking? Right? How about, right? And so the larger, the more significant and direct the costs are, the easier it is to make a case. Because who am I defending when I pass legislation here? I'm fighting for people on a justice basis. I'm fighting for people who are being oppressed. If you look at the ministry of Jesus, what did he do? He was helping the marginalized. He got angry a few times. He got angry at the temple when people were being abused. He got mad when kids were being messed with. He got mad at the Pharisees and their self-righteousness, right? So when the costs are larger and more direct, it's easier to make a case for Christians to get involved with government policy, to use government as an ethical, consistent, and practical means to an end. You can make the case as we come down here, but it gets more and more difficult. The other thing about this spectrum is if I think government ought to be involved here, then I ought to be that much more interested in government up here, right? If I think the government ought to outlaw Jehovah's Witnesses, then I certainly ought to be interested in child trafficking, sex trafficking, right? That's a more significant thing, right? So this is saying let's be consistent in our advocacy of government. And that as the costs are larger and more significant, then we're more likely to get the government involved. And so what I call justice issues are up here. So social justice would be things like abortion or sex trafficking. Economic justice would be things like theft and using the government to enrich an interest group at the expense of other people. Right? If the government is taking money from poor people and giving it to rich people, that would be a matter of economic justice. And then what I call social morality sorts of issues are down here, right, where it's still a sin, but the costs are less direct and less significant. Questions or other examples there? Okay. So some other considerations about when to bring the government in. The first is that if you look at the Old Testament, God gives a lot of freedom. You think back to Genesis 3, and Adam and Eve are in the garden, right? There's that one tree that they're not supposed to eat from, right? Does God build like a big old fence around that tree? Electric fence, right? It's an electric fence. When you read the King James that's in there, you translate that carefully. It says electric. No, there's no electric fence. He says, don't go near the tree, right? Actually, he doesn't say that. He says, don't eat from the tree specifically. So God gives a lot of freedom. And so one way to think of the question is, when should I use government to restrict freedom? When should I use government to quit getting you to do something? Right? When should I do that? Because God gives a lot of freedom, but when should I bring in government to restrict that freedom? That's one way that's helpful to think about. Second one is the ministry of Jesus. Can you imagine Jesus pursuing legislation? And under what conditions would you expect him to pursue legislation? When would he go to Austin to get laws passed? Because we're supposed to be Christ-like, right? I mean, so if we can't imagine Jesus doing it, maybe we should. So can you imagine Jesus going to Austin and saying, hey, can we keep weed illegal, please? Is that something Jesus would do? Would he go and say, we need to do something about sex trafficking? Can you picture Jesus doing that, right? So it used to be these bracelets that we would wear, WWJD, or what would Jesus do, right? And we could ask the same question here. When would Jesus pursue legislation? WWJPL, right? Let's get a new bracelet for that. One problem with it is that legislation is very wooden, right? Law is a very wooden way, unimaginative way to go about things. In John 8, a great passage that I think is helpful here, right? John 8 is the woman caught in adultery. And what are the two things that happen in that passage? Two big things that happen. What's he say to the Pharisees, basically? He gets them to drop their rocks, right? Basically, don't throw any rocks here. There's a sin, big sin, right? Someone just, I'll bring back my spectrum here. I mean, adultery was up here. That's a pretty big deal sin, right? And government policies like chucking rocks at people, right? Laws, let's throw people in jail. So Jesus says, let's not throw any rocks here. But what's he say at the end of the story?
We all commit sin.
Well, he implies that.
Forgiveness. Go and sin no more.
Go and sin no more. That's the balance we're looking for, right? When we deal with sinners in life, don't chuck rocks, but also exhort them to go and sin no more. And usually we usually pick up one or the other of those, right? We're chucking rocks at people for some sin, right? Maybe it's an environmental crime, or it's a politically correct thing, or they are involved in sex trafficking, or eating too much pie, or whatever it is, right? We chuck rocks at them and judge them. Or we miss the other side of the coin, right? We just kind of go, well, it's okay, we love you. And we forget to say, go and sin no more, right? That's the balance we're looking for. And law is not very good at that. Law is not very good at the balance of put down your rock and go and sin no more. It's very hard to do that with law. It's very hard to think of the ministry of Jesus and think about how that's consistent with a legislative approach. In chapter 6 of the book, I talk through a number of potential problems and concerns. A couple of them I'll list here. It tends towards judgmentalism, right? That when you pass laws against blank, it sets things up to be that you're going to be judgmental towards that thing. You either are being judgmental, or you're going to be perceived as judgmental. And that's not helpful to the kingdom of God. Sometimes it's legalism, right? That you set up, well, if I don't do this, this, and this, I guess I'm pretty good with God, right? And so it becomes a legalism. And so when you have a legislative approach and you have lots of do's and don'ts, that leads to other sorts of problems. And then, as I mentioned earlier, it's difficult to be consistent. The church hasn't done well with divorce and all sorts of sexual sin in the church, and yet for same-sex marriage, it's getting all excited. And that's not consistent. It doesn't make any sense. So this kind of summing up from a policy perspective is that aside from abortion and sex trafficking, kind of social justice sorts of issues, the religious right often chases the wrong issues. The religious right is spending a lot of time down here and getting the government involved here, and they don't spend much time talking about that end of the spectrum. And then the religious left is very excited about the right end of the spectrum, but they have all kinds of unbiblical and impractical ways to address the solution. Right? So we don't want to make either of these mistakes. We want to go after the right issues, and we want to have biblical, practical uses of government when we do so. And the religious left and right, those who are politically motivated among Christians, usually mess this up pretty badly. All right, for the practical concerns, then we'll go to Q&A. First one is, who will get into politics, and how will they respond to political temptations? I think one thing that's a mistake that's made often in government is that we assume that, well, high knowledge, high motive people will get in, and if they do, they'll pass good laws. But who goes into government? Well, it's a mixture of people. All sorts of people go into government. Some of them are morons, some of them are high motive, some are low motive, some are in it just to make a buck, right? It's all kinds of mixed motives, and so we get all kinds of mixed results. As Christians, same sort of thing, right? If we're going to advocate political solutions, who's really going to go into politics? And is it going to work out as well as I hope it will? And what will they do when they get there? How will they respond to the political temptations that they're going to face? And if I ask myself that question, I'm not as optimistic about what results I'm going to get. The second is that politics, and you've seen a lot of this the last 12 months, this was a bizarre election. I mean, it's been by far the most bizarre of my lifetime, maybe, I don't know, the most bizarre in history, I don't know, in American history, but certainly you all have seen this, right? And it has continued after the election that politics promote division and improper unity, right? People are unifying around garbage, right, on both sides of the aisle, and is promoting tons of division. Philip Yancey says, a political movement by nature draws lines, makes distinctions, pronounces judgment. In contrast, Jesus' love cuts across lines, transcends distinctions, and dispenses grace. If my political activism drives out such love, I betray his kingdom, right? The practice of politics can easily be inconsistent with the kingdom of God. It doesn't have to be, but it can be. And so if I promote division, if I promote improper unity around non-kingdom stuff, that's a big problem. Third, when is government a tool and when is it an idol? We've seen a lot of idolatry in the last 12 months. Which side lost was going to be the one that showed us their idolatry, right? And so you see people who are just getting horribly bent out of shape, right? If the other side had lost, you'd have people crying on the other side. So there's idolaters on both sides. But people who put way too much hope in government, they've made government an idol. And so what's the balance between government as a tool and government as an idol? And when it crosses over into idolatry, of course, we got big problems from a Christian worldview. C.S. Lewis in Screwtape Letters, let him begin by treating patriotism as part of his religion, then let him under the influence of partisan spirit come to regard it as the most important part, then quietly and gradually nurse him onto the stage at which the religion becomes merely a part of the cause in which Christianity is valued chiefly because of the excellent arguments it can produce, right? That the religion, the relationship with God is eventually supplanted by politics. And you've seen a lot of that in the last 12 months where people have politics on way too high of a pedestal. And they are pursuing government as an idol. And then finally, Econ 101 is opportunity cost, right? Opportunity cost means what? Hudson.
What you're giving up and what you get.
What you're giving up, right? The value of the next best alternative. When you're investing in politics, let's say you do it right. You put all these resources in, right? What's that mean? Well, unless you've mastered omnipresence, you're doing this, that means you're not doing this. So you're saying this is the most important use of my resource. The best use of my time, energy, talent, resources are right here compared to this. Is that a good choice? Sometimes. I'd say a lot of times not, right? Is watching another 10 hours of MSNBC or Fox News really a good move for the kingdom? Really good for your relationship with God and other people? We don't have enough disciple makers in the church. We have families and marriage that aren't what they should be, right? And every hour I spend on that, I'm not spending it with my wife and my kids. I'm not making disciples. I'm not making disciple makers. And so is that a good use of time? Even if politics is a good thing, that doesn't mean it's the best thing, right? And so we want to be careful to make the choices of what's best with what God's given us as we steward the time, talent, and treasure that he's given us. All right, let me go there. If you want to follow up on with email discussion after tonight, that's my email address. I'll be happy to interact with you after that. But any questions for you? Particular public policies, thoughts on the what to do with this?
I just wanted to ask your opinion, since you're an analyst of politics and how it links to evangelical Christianity. With this last election season that we saw a major deviation by the religious right in sort of who they chose. Not so much, I mean, you could say in the general election, but the biggest shocker was in the primaries. They chose to elect someone who is, to put it lightly, a firebrand. Someone who has been quoted many times as a blasphemy,
Right.
saying that he didn't need to repent because he was a perfect individual and things along those lines. Someone who is thrice married, a lot of things that don't line up with evangelical
Right.
views. How would you explain that deviation away from candidates who lined up so much more closely with historically how the religious right has voted, like Kasich or Cruz?
A bunch of stuff there, right? So first of all, I mean, obviously, I don't think the Republican, as many candidates as there were not very many impressive ones. We take a guy like Ted Cruz. We were just told 8 years ago by the Republicans that Obama didn't have enough experience to be president. He had the same level of experience that Cruz had. So Cruz was not a good candidate. I've mentioned Al Gore before. Cruz doesn't give any money to his church either, apparently. And he's supposed to be a faithful Christian, so I don't understand that. So Cruz, Rubio were inexperienced. Kasich was kind of a moderate. There really weren't a lot of great candidates, and I think Trump was the one that kind of stood out, and all these other guys were fighting over the rest of the percentage, and he was able to solidify that. So I think that's kind of the way it played out, that there were 18 candidates.
Stronger of a percentage than that, because I believe according to exit polls, it was something like 4 out of 5 white evangelicals voted for Trump.
Yes.
So
by the end of it, yeah, I think there's...
That seems like a lot more than squabbling for percentages.
Yes. Yeah, and in the South especially. I mean, you quibble with the statistics. I don't know what people are self-styling as an evangelical. Are they really evangelicals? But I think let's take it as they were evangelicals. Why would they vote for a guy like Trump? That's the point, and I think that's a great question. I think it goes back to idolatry, right? And I think it goes back to the point I made about ignorance. I think Christians are like anybody else in that we don't spend any time thinking about politics. We don't really think about all this stuff. We just kind of like the guy, and we're like anybody else in politics, and it shouldn't be that way. Again, because we have the name Christian. I mean, God's name got dirtied, sullied, right, because of what evangelicals did in voting for Trump and all the baggage that he had. So I think it's a great example of what I mentioned earlier about rational ignorance. We don't follow things that closely. And the fact is, Christians are usually one-issue kind of people. It's pretty much abortion, and that's it. So if you look at how Trump won, it was a lot of Republicans holding their nose, saying, well, he'll give us good Supreme Court nominees. And it was the Rust Belt with the trade protectionism stuff. And that's what won it for him. And then you have a Democratic candidate who was no better. I mean, she was more of a war candidate, more of a crony capitalist, more of a whatever. So, liberals couldn't have been happy either. And I was telling Tyler, what I learned in this election is we don't have very many liberals in this world, in the U.S. We don't have very many conservatives. We don't have many true conservatives or true liberals, or else we wouldn't have had these candidates. These are not liberal or conservative candidates. They're a populist and whatever Clinton was. I mean, two huge messes that the parties gave us, right? No one with reasonable standards could have been happy with either of those two, in my mind. But people don't pay much attention, I think, is the bottom line there. Other questions?
You ran for office.
Yeah.
Let's say you were elected. What would be the 3 things you would want to change or implement had you been elected to Congress?
Yeah. So I ran as a libertarian for Congress twice, 2006, 2008. And one of the, I'm going to go 2 ways in that question. The first is that reporters got smart at one point and said, well, even if you were elected, you're one vote. Well, you can't change anything, was their point. And they're right. One vote, even in Congress, doesn't change anything. And so what I said is, well, I won't be a vote, I'll be a voice. Right? That what you want there is not the one vote, it's the fact that you have a platform to talk about certain things that are really important to you, and you move the debate. That's what a one person, that's what I would have done. If I had the power to change public policy, what would I have changed? At the federal level, I don't know. I mean, to me, the biggest issue by far is K through 12 education, and that's not a federal policy. I would say it's state and local. Welfare policies cause a lot of damage, but most of that's been moved to the states. So I don't know what I would have done at the federal level to do much. At the time I ran, we were in the war in Iraq was going on, and I thought we should get out of that. We were sending taxpayer money to Planned Parenthood, and the GOP was supporting that. I think the number one thing I would have changed was tax reform. I said this in passing, but it bears fleshing out a little bit. There are two income taxes. I don't know if you all have jobs or not, but there are two income taxes, right? There's the April 15th file your 1040 income tax, right? That's the famous one, your W-2s, right? You all file tax forms, you know what that is, right? So that's the famous one. But then there's FICA. Does anyone know what FICA is? FICA, I know? It finances Social Security and Medicare. And that's a tax on your income. And unlike, you may have noticed on your income taxes, many of you didn't pay much, if anything, in income taxes because you get deductions and credits and exemptions. So most people, if you have a family of 4, you don't pay any income taxes, so you make like $50,000 a year. But FICA kicks in at the first dollar everybody earns, and it's 15.3%. So every dollar you earn is taxed at 15.3%. Let's say you're working poor. You're earning, say, $20,000 a year. That means the federal government's taking $3,000 from you every year. So that's the first thing I would change. If we care for poor people, why are we taking thousands of dollars every year from them to finance a program they'll pay for, they'll get to 40 or 50 years out? So I would do something with that.
I just want to make a quick comment on that,
Yep.
because I think the injustice of that is more than what you're saying. A, yes, we're taxing low-income people, which is especially burdensome. B, we're giving it to people like my mom and dad who are very well off,
Yep.
who don't need it. Now, there's the concept of entitlement to be paid in. The Supreme Court has actually ruled on this and says that FICA is just a tax like any tax. Nobody's actually entitled to that money.
Yep.
So there's a double injustice of taxing the poor to redistribute wealth up the income ladder to people who are on average quite well off. So would you favor a means test for recipients?
Yeah, means test, I'd exempt the first, any income under the poverty line, I would exempt that. So that 1040 file your April 15th taxes, only 20%, 80% pay more on FICA than they do in that. But no one ever knows about FICA because it's an invisible tax, it's a subtle tax, but it takes thousands of dollars from the working poor. Social Security is another one I would change. The average rate of return on Social Security is 0. For African Americans, it's negative because African Americans have a lower life expectancy. Right? So if you don't live as long, you don't get as much money. And so African Americans actually have a negative rate of return on Social Security. They put more money into it than they get out. So it's a lousy program that ought to be changed and ought to be transitioned from. So I would change the payroll tax and Social Security would be my top 2 at the federal level. And again, because you never hear Democrats talking about that. Let me say one more thing here. Democrats tell you they care about the working poor and middle class, and that's as much a lie as Republicans care about fiscal conservatism. Those are both lies. They do not care. If they cared, they would end that tax tomorrow. Democrats never talk about that, and that tells you they don't give a rat's patoot about the poor, right? A tax that takes 15. Can you imagine if I came up and said, "Hey, I want to start a new tax that takes 15% of every dollar a poor person makes"? People would go bananas over that. But that's the policy we have in the books right now, and that's totally unacceptable. And for a Democrat to claim to be a champion of the working poor and never talk about that is ridiculous.
But I think there's some outs for the working poor that the normal citizen doesn't have an opportunity to indulge in. For example, if a working poor family pays $800 or $900 in income taxes, they may get an $8,000 refund by the time it's all said and done.
There's an earned income tax credit that offsets some of the FICA, but it's not that level.
It happened to my son.
Yeah, it's not that level. I mean, the $800 tax would be only if they earned, what would that be? $5,000 would be an $5,000. They would not get an $8,000 credit on a $5,000 earning. So the numbers don't work out there. But you're right, there are some credits.
But I know for a fact that working poor get as much as 3 times back what they pay in.
On the income tax, but that's ignoring FICA.
That's correct.
Yeah, so we got to talk about FICA. All right, other things? Other questions?
You mentioned a couple of times you have problems with K through 12 education system. What are those?
Well, you guys are budding young economists, right? Monopoly bad, competition good. You don't need a PhD in econ for that one, right? So if you're, most of the time it's set up where you go to the public school in your neighborhood, and unless you can afford an option. And so middle class and poor people don't have the means to choose something other than that. And so you go to the government-run entity in your neighborhood. So it's government-run, huge monopoly power if you can't afford an option. Imagine we had a government restaurant system set up that way, right? Let's say that we say food's really important, and here's what we're going to do. If you're poor, we're going to have you go to the government-run restaurant in your neighborhood, and we're going to give you free meals, okay? You don't have to pay anything, you have free meals, but you got to go to this government-run restaurant in your neighborhood, right? What would the incentives for the manager of that restaurant be? What would you be concerned about in terms of incentives there? So what kind of outcomes would you be worried that you might find?
Just the food quality is bad.
Quality could be very bad.
If you won't be making any money whatsoever.
No. So and if the quality is bad in a competitive market, you never go back to the restaurant. If the quality is bad and you've got a monopolist to deal with, you got to keep going back. You've got a captive audience. So quality, you'd have concerns. Might be a little too much hair on the food, for example. That might be a problem. The quality's not very good. It's kind of lukewarm. All right. What else? What other disincentives would there be? The cost of the system might be overblown. Taxpayers are paying for it. I can just kind of pay people a little too much. I could waste money on this. A lot of red tape, a lot of bureaucracy, very expensive. You know what we spend on K through 12 education in this country per student? Anybody know? About? How about a classroom of 25? Let's go with that. Classroom of 25, what do you think we spend per classroom of 25? $300,000. Does that sound like enough money to educate a classroom of 25 people? You think a little more money would help? Maybe we move to 310. You think that would help? I mean, $300,000, isn't that enough? Would you have bureaucracy and red tape? Do what?
Prisons.
Let me finish education. So there's that, right? And then you would also worry about, are the customers going to be listened to, right? So let's say you roll into the government restaurant and you get the menu and it says burritos. You're like, oh, that's funny. I don't like burritos. And so you ask the server very kindly, hey, can I get something other than burritos? Well, no, sorry. We got burritos tonight. In fact, every night's burrito night at our restaurant. You're like, well, I don't like burritos. And they're like, well, too bad, right? And so you'd have people shoving a menu down your throat, right? And so what do we find? Well, every year the middle class, even middle class schools have this. They complain about what deity we're going to pray to at graduation, and how we're going to teach sex ed, and how we're going to do Common Core, and all these different things. Well, you can get good quality out of a public school, but you'd be worried about it. You can get a lean, mean machine out of a public school, but you'd be worried about wasting money and bureaucracy. You can get a school that's attentive to customer needs, but you'd worry about that. And in fact, those are exactly the things that get complained about in K through 12. And so a government-run monopoly, you can get great results, but you can get horrible results from that. And so competition, even the private sector would be nice, but at least some competition would be really helpful. And again, it's the inner city poor in particular that take a beating with that policy. And what's worse than giving a kid a ninth grade education and saying, hey, good luck to you, see you in prison or something, we don't sell drugs, we'll toss you in jail. I mean, that's kind of our plan for the inner cities, right? Give them a ninth grade education, tempt them to sell some drugs, toss them in jail. We'll see in about 20 years. I mean, that's in a nutshell what we do with the inner cities. Speaking of prisons, I'm not an expert on that, so I don't know much about prisons. I mean, I know there's been back and forth about privatizing and.
Well, there's a lot more spent to house a prisoner than to educate a
Right.
K-12 child.
Yeah.
That was my point.
Yeah. And because we don't do education right, and we do these other things, we end up spending even more money in the prison system. So that's absolutely right.
Well, to stay on that same topic, the issue with privatizing prisons is that we've seen time and time again that privatizing prisons, the corporations that run those prisons low-cost strategies and end up putting the prisoners in
Right.
really poor situations with substandard care. Would you not end up seeing the same, if you were talking about schools that were that could be more price competitive with each other to offer lower prices for education to lower to middle income families, wouldn't that price competition end up driving down costs and still putting out a relatively poor performance when schools involved?
Yeah, I think with prisons, you've got a choice between a public monopoly and a private monopoly. And so it's really not public-private as much as it is monopoly. There's still only one prison. It's prisoners dealing with the government. It's still a monopoly. What ought to happen in education is competition. I can choose any of 5 different schools, and it's not private-public as much as it is competition. And prisons don't really have that, I don't think. I mean, there's pretty much one prison provider that contracts with the government, and it's still a monopolist. It's a private monopoly, which you don't expect to be much better than a public
like I
monopoly.
was trying to stay close to the topic of schools and prisons. I was just using what has happened with privatization of prisons as an example. But with schools, I still don't think if you privatize schools like that, or if you had just some privatized schools, are you suggesting to still have public schools in addition to private schools, or just to privatize education?
Yeah, I would advocate either what's called vouchers, like food stamps, you'd have education stamps, or what's called backpack funding. And so right now, if my kid walks through the doors of a school, the state automatically, the locals and states give money to that school. The problem is I'm forced to send my kid to this particular school. Backpack funding would be whatever doors my kid walks through, the funding follows them. And so if they go to school X, Y, or Z, the money follows them, whether private or public. It's not public schools per se that are the issue. Again, it's not public or private. It's that I've got one choice. It's monopoly. And so if I have 4 choices and my funding, the funding allocated to my child follows me, then that'll get you
So
competition.
you're saying 4 choices that are within your price range. Because private schools exist. It's just they exist and they tend to be expensive. Am I misreading that? Or?
I mean, there are expensive private schools, but they're usually private schools are much cheaper than public schools. What we spend, private schools are, $6,000, $7,000, $8,000. Again, in public schools, we spend $10,000 to $12,000. So we spend a lot more on public. And so if you had a backpack funding of say $6,000 to $8,000, that would be sufficient for most private schools.
Those private schools educating the same group of students?
Are they what?
Educating the same group of students.
Right, so you might have, and Arizona does this, so like I say you have special ed students. Already Arizona has additional backpack funding. So if the state says, hey, look, your kid has special needs, it's going to take $15,000 to educate your child, and the $15,000 follows me to that district.
Is the issue that you have if open enrollment was in public schools, would you be for that?
That would help. So Indiana, for example, has that where you don't have to go to the one in your neighborhood. You can go to anyone you can transport your kid to. So that allows choice. That's kind of like the post office, right? Imagine if the post office said, hey, you got to go to the post office branch next to your house. No, you can go to whatever post office you want. You can go to whichever of those you want. And again, there's a little bit of competition there. It's still the government monopoly, but at least the branches have to compete a little bit. All right, good. Other thoughts on Christian political activism? Have we have talked about the religious left at all? Anything on the left that you have seen? There's a lot of injustice out there. I mean, you're doing good stuff in economics, and there's a lot of stuff where the poor get abused. There's social justice sorts of issues. There's labor market regulations. There's a lot of stuff to be excited about. So the question again is, do you get involved in politics, and if so, which issues, and to get knowledgeable so that you're not a dupe and cause more trouble than